In the summer of 1858, the British Parliament had a problem. Not a small problem, not a manageable problem. A problem so enormous, so inescapable, so brutally physical that it had finally become impossible to ignore. The problem was the smell. But here is the thing. The smell had been there for years. Decades, actually. The River Thames, running directly beneath the windows of the most powerful building in the country, had been slowly transforming into something that no polite Victorian vocabulary was equipped to describe. And for years, the politicians sitting inside that building had done absolutely nothing about it. This is not a story about a river. It is a story about what happens when powerful people refuse to act on a disaster until the disaster reaches them personally. And it turns out that story is much older than you think. The real question is not why London smelled so terrible in 1858. The real question is why it took so long for anyone to do anything about it. And the answer to that question reveals something uncomfortable about how humans make decisions. But before we get there, we need to understand exactly how bad things had actually become. London in the early 19th century was a city that had completely outgrown itself. In 1800, roughly 1 million people lived there. By 1850, that number had more than doubled. 2.5 million human beings packed into a city whose infrastructure had been designed for a fraction of that population. Streets that had been built for horses and carts were now drowning in foot traffic. Buildings went up faster than anyone could plan for them, and the sewage system, such as it was, had never really been a system at all. For centuries, Londoners had relied on cesspools. Every house had one dug beneath it, a pit in the ground designed to collect waste. In theory, these pits would be emptied regularly by workers called night soil men, who would come under cover of darkness, remove the contents, and sell them to farmers outside the city as fertilizer. It was unpleasant work, but it was a system that functioned, just barely, when the population was small enough. When the population doubled, the system collapsed. Cesspools overflowed. They leaked into the soil, they seeped into the groundwater. And then, in the 1840s, something happened that made everything dramatically worse. The flush toilet arrived. Now, the flush toilet sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. But London's existing drains, the underground channels that had been built over centuries to carry rainwater away from streets, were not designed to carry sewage. They were not sealed. They were not deep enough, and they emptied directly into the River Thames. Within a few years, the combination of 2.5 million people, overflowing cesspools, and newly installed flush toilets had turned the Thames into an open sewer running through the heart of the capital. The river was dark. It was thick. And on warm days, particularly in summer, it produced a smell that people compared to death itself. And yet, Parliament did nothing. To understand why, you need to understand what people in 1850 believed about disease. The dominant theory of illness at the time was called miasma theory. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or bad air. The idea was straightforward. Disease was caused by foul-smelling air. If something smelled bad, it made you sick. If it smelled neutral or pleasant, it was safe. This theory was not fringe thinking. It was the established medical consensus, endorsed by the most respected doctors and public health officials in the country. When cholera epidemics swept through London in 1832 and again in 1848, killing tens of thousands of people, the official explanation was miasma, bad air rising from the filth of the poor neighborhoods. The solution, therefore, was to clear out the smell, remove the waste, ventilate the streets. What almost nobody believed, despite growing evidence, was that disease traveled through water. A doctor named John Snow had other ideas. In 1854, during a particularly deadly cholera outbreak in the Soho neighborhood of London, Snow conducted one of the most important investigations in medical history. He mapped every cholera death in the area, street by street, house by house, and discovered something that miasma theory could not explain. The deaths were clustered, not spread evenly through the neighborhood as bad air would produce, but concentrated around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow removed the handle from that pump. The outbreak stopped almost immediately. His conclusion was clear. Cholera was not spread through air, it was spread through contaminated water. The Thames, into which London's sewage now emptied, was the source. The medical establishment largely rejected this. The man responsible for London's public health, a physician named John Simon, acknowledged Snow's work but continued to maintain that miasma was the primary cause of disease. The great sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick, who had spent years campaigning to improve conditions for the poor, believed so deeply in miasma theory that he had actually made things worse. His solution to the smell problem had been to flush London's cesspools directly into the Thames, on the theory that moving the waste out of the city would remove the bad air. This had accelerated the poisoning of the river. So here is where we are by 1855. The Thames is an open sewer. The cholera deaths have been demonstrably linked to contaminated water. A brilliant physician has proven this beyond reasonable doubt. And Parliament, sitting in a building directly above the river, continues to debate, delay, and do nothing. Why? This is the part of the story that nobody talks about. The answer is money. Fixing London's sewage system would cost an enormous amount. Various proposals had been put forward over the years. Engineers had submitted plans. Reports had been commissioned. Committees had met and deliberated and produced documents that were filed and forgotten. The problem was that nobody wanted to pay for it. The Metropolitan Board of Works, which had been created in 1855 specifically to address London's infrastructure problems, had been given responsibility for sewage but almost no authority to raise money. The parishes and districts that made up the city guarded their financial independence fiercely. National government did not want to set a precedent of funding local infrastructure. Local government did not want to take on the debt. And so the years passed. The river got worse. The smell intensified, and the politicians continued to meet in their grand building beside the Thames and talk about the problem without solving it. And then the summer of 1858 arrived. It was an unusually hot summer. And in an unusually hot summer, what was already unbearable became something else entirely. The Thames, baking under weeks of heat, began to produce gases at a rate that overwhelmed everything. The smell did not stay down by the river. It rose, it spread, it entered buildings. It was not just unpleasant, it was physical. People reported feeling sick at the smell. Newspapers stopped printing polite euphemisms and began using the phrase that would define that summer: the Great Stink. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament were soaked in chloride of lime in an attempt to filter the air. It did not work. Members of Parliament reportedly attempted to use the riverside rooms of the building and were driven back by the smell within minutes. Legal proceedings in nearby courts were adjourned. People crossing Waterloo Bridge held handkerchiefs to their faces. The Times of London declared that the stench from the river was, quote, a sweet compound of all possible stinks, which, given Victorian standards of understatement, represents something close to a crisis of civilization. And suddenly, with remarkable speed, Parliament acted. A bill to fund a new sewage system for London was passed in 18 days. 18 days. After years of committees and debates and proposals and delays, a solution appeared in under 3 weeks. The man given the job of designing and building it was a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. What Bazalgette created was, at the time, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. A network of underground sewers stretching for over 80 miles, built to carry London's waste east, away from the city, to treatment facilities where it could be released into the Thames at a safe distance. The system included massive pumping stations to move sewage uphill when necessary. It was built from over 300 million bricks. It took 16 years to complete. The cholera epidemic stopped. Not immediately. Not without resistance from those who still believed in miasma. But when the sewers were complete and the clean water supply was separated from the waste, London's death toll from waterborne disease collapsed. John Snow had been right all along. Now, here's the part of this story that most people get wrong. The popular version of The Great Stink is a comedy. Politicians too proud to acknowledge a problem until it walked in through their windows. A crisis solved by disgust rather than wisdom. And that is true, but it misses something important. The thing that finally worked was not better scientific understanding. Parliament passed the sewage bill during the Great Stink, while still largely rejecting Snow's water contamination theory. The dominant belief was still miasma. They were building the sewers, many of them believed, to remove the bad air, not the contaminated water. They accidentally solved the right problem for the wrong reasons. This is the strange truth at the center of the Great Stink. London was saved not because the authorities finally understood what was killing people. It was saved because the consequences of inaction finally became personal and inescapable for the people with the power to act. Edwin Chadwick had spent 20 years publishing reports on the health of the poor. Jon Snow had provided clear evidence of how cholera spread. Reformers had been shouting about the state of the Thames for decades. None of it moved Parliament to act quickly. One bad summer did. This is not ancient history. The gap between what is known and what is done, between evidence and action, between the suffering of people who cannot make their problem impossible to ignore and the comfort of people who can look away, is not a Victorian peculiarity. It is a pattern as old as human institutions. The Great Stink of 1858 did not happen because Victorians were uniquely foolish or corrupt. It happened because the people who could solve the problem did not personally feel the consequences of leaving it unsolved. And when they finally did, when the smell that had been destroying working-class neighborhoods for decades finally reached the rooms where decisions were made, the solution appeared in 18 days. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers are still under London, still working, still carrying away what the city produces. A permanent monument to the gap between knowing something is a problem and doing something about it. The Thames is clean now. You can swim in it. Salmon have returned to a river that was, within living memory, biologically dead. And every time you hear that a known problem has finally received funding after years of delay, it is worth remembering the summer of 1858 and the curtains soaked in chemicals and the men who could not ignore any longer what everyone else had been living with for years. Next time, we are going to look at a story where the problem was not a smell, but a sound. Specifically, the sound of an enormous, unstoppable, completely avoidable disaster that everyone could hear coming, and nobody found a way to stop. That is coming next. For now, the Thames is clean. It took the right people a very, very long time to notice it needed to be.